It was in the early days of 2026 when dawn in Borno State did not bring the warm colors one might associate with New Day, but a dense, heavy silence, almost supernatural. The sky over the desert, over the hills and eroded savannas, remained still, as if the land itself was holding its breath, anticipating what could be the end of a chapter of horror that had lasted more than a decade. In the heart of that vast landscape, entire communities still bore the scars, both visible and invisible, of years of violence deeply rooted in the social fabric of Nigeria. The northeastern corridor, particularly Borno, was the epicenter of this story of insurgency, fear, and resistance. In this context, news spread quickly across the country and, to a lesser extent, to international newsrooms. The Nigerian military had killed Bako Gorgori, one of the most notorious commanders of the Islamic State West Africa province, ISWAP, one of the most active and lethal factions that had emerged from the brutal conflict with Boko Haram and its successors. For many, the name Gorgori had meant little until recent years. For thousands of families across the Lake Chad Basin and the Sambisa Forest, however, it was synonymous with terror, indiscriminate violence, and the forced recruitment of young fighters in a war that seemed endless. The official announcement was brief, formal, military. A statement from the Nigerian Federal Army detailed that, after a carefully planned operation under the counteroffensive known as Operation Hadin Kai, the official armed forces' effort against insurgent groups in the Northeast since 2015, the forces had located the camp where Gorgori and his group were hiding and, in a decisive confrontation, neutralized the commander and dismantled his command center. Although official information is usually sparse and in some aspects deliberately controlled for institutional and operational security, the impact of the announcement was immediate. A mixture of relief, skepticism, and profound questions about the future of a region that for years had known little but continuous violence. To understand why this event resonated both within and outside Nigeria, it is necessary to go back to the origins of the insurgency that, in various forms, had ravaged the northeast of the country since the late 2000s. The Boko Haram insurgency, officially called Jama'atu al-Sunnah Wadi wal Jihad, emerged as a radicalized movement rejecting the Nigerian state, seeking to impose a violent interpretation of Islamic law, and extending its control over rural areas through extreme coercion. The emergence, expansion, and brutality of this group, and later its offshoots like ISWAP, turned parts of Borno, Yobe, and Adamawa into zones where the state had little or no effective control for years. The split that created ISWAP in 2015 was not only organizational, but also ideological and strategic. ISWAP separated from Boko Haram largely due to disagreements over leadership and the indiscriminate brutality that characterized its predecessor under Abubakar Shako. That division did not reduce the overall violence, but generated a different operational dynamic. ISWAP developed a notable ability to organize coherent command structures, manage temporarily controlled territories, and, over time, establish logistical and recruitment networks that challenged Nigerian military efforts. Within that framework emerged a figure of Bako Gorgori. Journalistic sources and intelligence analyses, though cautious with specific names due to the opacity of insurgent structures, placed him as one of the highest-ranking commanders within ISWAP, responsible for operations in the Lake Chad region and the extensive network of forests and paths connecting several communities in the northeast. His rise occurred during a period when ISWAP not only resisted the Nigerian Army, but also sought to consolidate its own legitimacy among populations exhausted by years of conflict. Gorgori, according to security reports and ex-combatant testimonies, was known for his ruthlessness, his ability to mobilize cells, and above all, his willingness to employ violent tactics against both civilians and security forces alike. Violence under his command, like that of other insurgent leaders, was neither isolated nor episodic. Thousands of attacks attributed to Islamist factions occurred over the years, targeting both military and civilian objectives, with a recurring pattern of massacres, kidnappings, and destruction of essential infrastructure. The impact was particularly severe for agricultural and fishing communities along Lake Chad, as well as for displaced populations constantly fleeing from one place to another in search of safety. The Sabin-Gari attack in January 2026, just months before the operation that killed Gorgori, exemplified the type of brutality that continued to define the region, a coordinated assault that left dozens of construction workers and military personnel dead, according to multiple journalistic and police sources. That attack was not only a reminder of the constant danger posed by insurgents, but also an indication of ISWAP's operational resilience even after years of military pressure. During 2025, several analytical reports highlighted a significant increase in ISWAP's capability to not only resist, but also launch effective offensives and temporarily take control of military posts in the area, reflecting both the complexity of ground warfare and the structural limitations of the Nigerian security apparatus. On the state front, Nigeria responded with a continuous military effort called Operation Hadin Kai, a counterinsurgency campaign formally launched in 2015, and adapted over the years to confront the evolving tactics of armed groups. The term Hadin Kai comes from Hausa, meaning cooperation or unity, reflecting the official intention to integrate various branches of the armed forces and coordinate actions with regional allies to contain and eventually defeat insurgents. However, Operation Hadin Kai faced multiple challenges. Some derive from the harsh geography of northeastern Nigeria, a mix of forests, flood-prone areas, and difficult-to-control borderlands, and from the complex social dynamics of communities often trapped between insurgent violence and a state presence sometimes perceived as distant or insufficient. Another major challenge was ISWAP's ability to integrate into local networks, relying on forced recruitment and coercion to maintain its ranks, as well as adaptive tactics, including improvised explosive devices, ambushes, and, in some cases, drones for reconnaissance or targeted attacks. By 2026, Hadin Kai had become a war of attrition, a mixture of military offensives, intelligence operations, and efforts to regain territories temporarily controlled by insurgents. The elimination of insurgent leaders had been, at times, an explicit objective of the military strategy, but independent verification of these deaths was often difficult given the isolation of the areas and political interests at play. This created, among the national and international public, a mixture of expectation and skepticism whenever the neutralization of commander was announced. In that context occurred the operation that, according to official statements, ended Bako Gorgori's life. The operation was described as months of work, based on intelligence gathered by special army units and Nigerian intelligence services, supported by aerial surveillance images obtained through advanced drone technology. Official reports indicated that, after precisely identifying the location of the camp where Gorgori and his group were hiding, Nigerian forces moved silently through extremely difficult terrain and, in a coordinated maneuver, surrounded the facility before launching a coordinated attack that, according to the Army, completely dismantled enemy resistance. The images and accounts leaked to some local media depicted soldiers advancing under an unforgiving sun, crossing swampy areas with barely any defined paths, guided only by coordinates and the certainty that, on the other side of the cordon, awaited the primary objective of the operation, to dismantle one of the group's most dangerous command centers. While operational details are often restricted for security reasons and for the success of future actions, the official version emphasized that the action was executed with minimal collateral damage and maximum precision, reducing the possibility of civilian casualties. Gorgori's death was celebrated in certain sectors as a milestone in the fight against insurgency, particularly by the families of victims who had long seen in him one of the most notorious symbols of the violence that had plagued their lives. For many, it marked the end of an era of terror exerted by a single man whose influence had seemed almost omnipresent in the region for years. Relief was palpable in the markets of Maiduguri, in fishing villages along Lake Chad, and in agricultural communities, where voices rose with cautious optimism, as if for the first time in years they could glimpse a reprieve from constant uncertainty and grief. Yet even amid this relief, analytical reading demanded caution. The death of a commander, no matter how prominent or feared, does not guarantee the end of an insurgency that has proven resilient and adaptive. The ISWAP context and armed organizations in northeastern Nigeria form a mosaic of alliances, fractures, and constant reconfigurations, where leaders emerge, fall, and are replaced, often without causing an immediate change in the operational capacity of the broader group. Indeed, according to some security reports and UN analyses, ISWAP had intensified its activity on multiple fronts before 2026, with a broader range of operations and a flexible structure capable of withstanding leadership losses, suggesting that the elimination of key figures may not be a fatal blow, but one component in a prolonged struggle. Moreover, the insurgency's own nature, fueled by endemic poverty, Historical marginalization of entire regions, lack of access to education, and limited economic opportunities indicates that a strictly military approach will hardly solve the deep-rooted causes of the problem. In many affected communities, young people are trapped in a vicious cycle in which the lack of alternatives makes them more vulnerable to forced recruitment and to perpetuating a cycle of violence. From this perspective, Gorgori's death represents, without doubt, a significant moment in the narrative of the conflict, but it should not be seen as a final point. Rather, it is a milestone within a broader process of institutional and social transformation that Nigeria, with the support of regional and international partners, still needs to face. The reconstruction of liberated territories, the reintegration of ex-combatants, attention to conflict victims, and promotion of sustainable economic opportunities are tasks that demand not only resources, but sustained political commitment and long-term vision that transcend cycles of violence. Meanwhile, the Nigerian armed forces continue to face operational, logistical, and strategic challenges in a vast and complex territory where state presence has been intermittent and sometimes insufficient. Operation Hadin Kai, with all its achievements and limitations, is only part of a larger approach that must include not only military responses, but comprehensive public policies addressing the root causes of insurgency. Looking to the future, it is clear that eliminating insurgent leaders like Gorgori can offer temporary reprieves, shared moments of relief, and an opportunity for communities to breathe a little easier. But lasting peace requires more, a structural transformation that allows future generations to build their lives outside the shadow of violence and despair. Meanwhile, the story of Bako Gorgori and Operation Hadin Kai will remain in the records as an important, but not definitive, chapter in a complex and still unfinished history of insurgency in northeastern Nigeria. For those who have lived under the shadow of that violence, the current challenge is to transform the lessons learned into actions that truly change the conditions of insecurity, marginalization, and suffering that have marked their lives for so long. And so, as the camera rises once more over the landscape of Borno, we are invited, as viewers, analysts, citizens of the world, not to turn away from a critical gaze, not to forget the human dimension behind the headlines, and to continue exploring, with rigor and responsibility, the stories that define our time. If you have followed this story this far, stay with us in future episodes where we will continue to explore conflicts, institutions, and lives that shape our world.